Hi, I'm Stewart Spinks and welcome to episode 313 of my podcast, Beekeeping Short and Sweet. A funny thing happened in the apiaries last week and it got me thinking about what might be going on. We were removing the drone brood frames as a varroa control mechanism, and some of the frames were simply filled with honey, while others were packed with brood. Oh, and lots of varroa. Something's going on, but what? Beekeeping Short and Sweet, a beekeeping podcast for the inquisitive beekeeper with a short attention span. A beekeeper, in fact, just like me. This week's podcast is sponsored in part by Modern Beekeeping, suppliers of general beekeeping equipment including high-density polyhives. These include Paradise National hives, Swenty polyhives and of course honeypore hives, my particular favourite. More than this, Modern Beekeeping also supply traditional cedar and pine hives, a range of very effective bee feeds called Apimix and Apipasta, and a full range of all the must-have beekeeping equipment for every beekeeper. For all your beekeeping needs, contact Paul at Modern Beekeeping by visiting their website www.modernbeekeeping.co.uk. Hello everyone, here we are in August and that's pretty much it for the honey crop here in Norwich, or is it? Something's afoot, as they say. We still have something of a crop coming in. I wouldn't call it a nectar flow, but our colonies do still have liquid nectar filling up cells in the brood box, a sure sign they have something from somewhere. Several of our colonies have workers with the telltale creamy white stripe down the middle of their thorax, a sure sign that these bees have found some Himalayan balsam. Not much, as it's only a few workers that show this sign, yet there is nectar coming in from somewhere. I suspect it will dry up pretty quickly, but let's enjoy this late season bonus while we can. I'm delighted with it. We've had to add additional supers to several colonies in order to cope. In another apiary, the clover field is still giving up a crop, another bonus for me, as we really didn't expect to see very much at all from these colonies, yet we're averaging over 3 supers from each one. Remarkably, one of those colonies was just a 3-frame nucleus colony in early June, yet they have exploded into life and have contributed a full super of summer honey to the mix as well. This little colony really seemed to struggle. We added a new queen to them in June, yet because they had so few bees, they were unable to develop a large enough brood nest area early in the season. Remember, it was cold and wet, and I think the workers were simply unable to maintain any kind of brood nest temperature across more than 1 or 2 small areas on 1 or 2 frames. I had kept them in a 4-frame honeypore nuke box. These, while they may seem small, really do help insulate the nuke and allows them to not only survive but to grow. Once they'd grown across all 4 frames, we moved them into a full-size hive with a foam divider used as a dummy board, and as they grew a little more, I added another frame of drawn comb rather than foundation, and that really helped. The brood nest got a little bigger each week, and when finally they were able to look after a full frame of brood, it was just a matter of time before the box exploded into life with all of those newly emerging workers filling up that brood box. That in turn meant the queen could increase her egg-laying rates significantly, and with more bees to look after the young larvae, it wasn't long before we're looking at a full brood box of sealed brood. Queen excluder and super added just in time for the last week or so of that summer nectar flow. I've always found clover honey something of a lucky find rather than a crop we specifically enjoy year in, year out. I've not ever been lucky enough to have an apiary in a clover meadow on a permanent basis, apart from some bees on an alpaca farm some years ago. But the alpacas kept eating the clover, I think, so we never really got to benefit. What we have found is more farmers seemingly wanting to plant clover to fix nitrogen in the root nodules of the plant, and, with a little luck and the right weather, the plants flower before the farmer ploughs in the clover to release that nitrogen back into the soil. This year is just such a year, and we're about to start bringing back the supers from this apiary to extract, maybe next week or possibly the week after. Something we are able to do as a small producer of honey is to keep it all apiary specific. This means extracting the honey from one apiary at a time and identifying the type of honey it is from pollen samples taken from the honey itself. So here, in this example, it's pretty obvious the bees are foraging clover. The field is around 50 metres away. The honey is a light colour. The bees are really busy on a nectar flow, and the clover is in full bloom. Walking through the field, you can see that there are honeybees working the individual flowers. All the evidence points to the honey being clover, and as such, we can adjust our labels to identify it as this. But only once I carry out microscopy checks to confirm the majority of the pollen in the honey is clover. I once visited a fellow beekeeper in Cambridgeshire to introduce him to microscopy work, and he produced a jar of named dandelion honey that he'd purchased, and we used it as a sample to see what pollen was within. Now, dandelion has a very distinctive pollen grain. It's difficult not to see it. Yet this honey didn't have a single grain of dandelion pollen in it. Strange, huh? Either the producer put it through a very fine filter, or the bees had found another high-yielding plant and completely ignored the dandelion. A warning to anyone labelling their honey as a monofloral honey without checking it first, I think. No such issues with our borage honey, of course, yet I would do the same investigatory work to be sure. Location of apiary, proximity of the borage crop, is it in flower, is there a nectar flow, are there any other plants yielding nectar in the same location, and finally, of course, the microscopy check for the pollen in the honey. If all the boxes get ticked, then the label can name the plant. It's a part of beekeeping I really enjoy, as you're probably aware by now. Talking borage, it's being cut, or more properly described as swathed. This process is used to allow the crop to dry out and mature a little bit longer, with the cut plants gathered together in a row a bit like hay fields. The borage is held up off the ground by the remaining stalks, and with luck the farmer gets the air beneath the plant to dry them out a little before going back to harvest the now mature seeds. At this point you could say the nectar flow is over, and for the most part you'd be right. That said, the plant seems to suddenly switch to regrowth mode, having lost its main stem and the flowering heads that produce seed, and as a result they sometimes send out regrown flowering shoots from the stems still in the ground. This can generate a late bonus nectar flow, which last year resulted in an additional crop of maybe 100 to 150 kilos of honey. Not bad at all, thank you very much. That said, we're back next week to get the main crop of honey off and prepare the bees to journey back home. Once the nectar dries up, colonies do start to look elsewhere for food, and in an area where lots of beekeepers have hives to benefit from this crop, it's easy to have your bees rob out a weak, diseased hive and bring that disease back to your own apiary. Once again, there are risks to this highly productive crop. We'll bring the bees back home a little earlier this year, as we're going to split colonies to make up nukes to overwinter, and the queens are due to arrive soon. Talking of the borage, I'm very excited to finally get that section rack off and see what the finished product looks like. If you've seen the last video of the thorn section rack, you'll know just how amazing they all looked, even though I say so myself. The next task with these sections is to find some packaging for them. It deserves something classy, a display case type of protective wrap. But so far, all I've found is some slightly outdated looking cardboard boxes. Maybe it will have to be something bespoke, handcrafted and undoubtedly expensive. I'll let you know if I find anything worthwhile. Meanwhile, we've been preparing colonies for the trip to the heather, but have delayed this trip by 1 week due to the poor weather and the lateness of the heather flowering on our moor. The preparation includes a brood frame shuffle, the removal of honey supers, the addition of heather honey supers, and all clipped together ready to be lifted onto the trailer. Again, at this location, the bees seem to have found a late nectar flow. I discovered this the day after we added the clearer boards and popped back to remove the supers and those clearer boards. I thought I'd take a quick look in one of the supers to see what was going on. It was one with drawn comb, and the colony had already begun filling and capping 2 frames in the middle of that super. It's likely, given the delay I've imposed on myself in moving the bees to the heather, I'll have to pop back in and swap out these frames for empty ones. Otherwise, we'll be in the same position as last year in taking a load of honey up to the moors just to bring it back home again 3 or 4 weeks later. Not ideal. The delay in the move to the moors hopefully will be the right choice, but now I've made that decision I can't go back, so it will have to be what it will be. Just thinking about the preparation for that move again, I almost forgot the main point of today's podcast, which is the removal of those drone brood frames for varroa management. So, just to recap, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, we removed a grotty old brood frame from our colonies and replaced it with a frame of drone foundation. The purpose of this was to encourage the colony to draw out those drone cells for the queen to lay unfertilised eggs into them, and for this to act as a magnet on the varroa population within that hive and entice these mites into the drone cells, where, once capped, we could remove the frame along with any varroa trapped inside, thus reducing the population of the varroa by a significant number prior to any autumn and winter bees being produced. This, hopefully, increases the overall health and fitness of the colony, allowing them to be better able to endure the cold months ahead. My aim is to reduce my dependence on chemical treatments, not to allow me to go completely treatment-free at the moment, but I mentioned before it would be great to have varroa-resistant colonies. Maybe varroa tolerant is a better description, but actually I think I'm a long way off this, so a little mechanical varroa removal is a good starting point, I think. Just consider this for a moment. It might be that a twice-a-year drone brood removal system might be a better option than using chemicals, but let's leave that until next year now. What I discovered in removing these brood frames was really quite striking and something I want to understand further, if only I had more time. We removed around 20 drone frames. Of these, 3 or 4 were completely devoid of any brood at all. The bees had done a great job in drawing out the foundation into those usable combs, yet the queen had not laid a single egg in any of the cells, and the bees had filled up that available space with honey and capped it off. I need to go back to these colonies and look more closely, but at the time we were just too busy preparing colonies for the trip north, so couldn't spare that time. Is it likely these colonies had no need or desire to produce drones? If so, they were very much in the minority. The other colonies had, for the most part, produced a solid frame of drone comb, and again, for the majority, the queen had laid unfertilised eggs, and these had been mostly capped off. There were a couple that were in the final day or 2 of being capped off, and these showed some interesting features. I removed all of these sacrificial frames, with the exception of the ones simply filled with honey, and those were moved to the outer edge of the brood box and left for the bees to use as winter food. If this process works successfully, I'll simply switch the positions of these frames in the spring and use them at that stage for varroa control once more. Now, what about those frames that had drone brood in them? Well, they all came back to base to go into the freezer, only I had to go out and buy a replacement freezer, wouldn't you just know it? But that put a couple of days delay between the removal of the frames and getting those frames into the freezer. However, during that delay, something really interesting happened. Larvae that hadn't been capped fell or crawled out of the cells, and along with them came literally hundreds of varroa mites. I was so surprised that I took the trolley base outside and hosed it clean before remembering that I should have taken a photograph. The good news is the frames did find their way into the freezer, and there they are currently housed, waiting for me to find the time to have a closer look. But the process of simply putting these frames into the freezer meant I could have a quick look in the cells that hadn't yet been sealed, and it's quite frightening the number of varroa mites that I could see in and around those drone cells. This process really does seem to have worked really rather well. So, what have I learnt so far? Well, timing is everything. I think I might be inclined to put a frame in sometime around mid-June next year, maybe after the spring honey crop comes off. Perhaps I was a little late for those colonies that haven't had their queen lay eggs in those cells. It remains to be seen what the varroa loading in those colonies looks like. The process suits my beekeeping, and with the chance to reduce further our use of chemical treatments, that can only be a good thing. Now, I'm not advocating this to everyone, and certainly if you're a new beekeeper, then you have enough to think about already without me complicating matters. With that in mind, it's now time to begin treating colonies if that's your chosen route. There are lots of treatments out there, and most will do a very good job in reducing varroa numbers at this important time of the year. Well, that's it for this week. Don't forget to check out my website, www.norfolk-honey.co.uk, and for my latest videos and podcasts with more updates, tips and techniques, it's the same Patreon page, www.patreon.com/Norfolk Honey. And remember, I'm Stewart Spinks, and that was Beekeeping Short and Sweet.